Okay, I will kick off then. Can everyone hear me at the back okay? Awesome. So thank you for being here. Glad to know that I'm not the only one that gets a bit geeky about containers. I did notice that Martin was speaking now, so obviously a tough crowd to pitch against, but looking forward to sharing this talk with you. Before I get started, I love this conversation. People have strong opinions, particularly where Kubernetes is concerned. Anybody working with containers in any capacity right now? Let's get a feel for who we've got in the room. Okay, so nearly everybody, most people in some way or another. Who is working with Kubernetes right now? Okay, so quite a few embattled people. Anyone working with ECS? Okay, cool. So hopefully some of this should really align with the decisions and conversations we've already had, and some of it might actually shape some of the conversations you have moving forward. So let's get started then. Containers are quite simple. You sort of explain containers to somebody, they're fairly easy, they're fairly logical. The actual concept of a container is not the problem, but as they scale, things get really complex, and that complexity starts to creep in. That long-term adoption is more than just containerizing workloads, but it's managing that full end-to-end cycle, all the decisions like the things we're going to talk about around the platform and the networking, and then all the CI/CD pipelines. So there's a lot of things that start to come to play. Now, there might be lots of reasons why the places that you work or the decisions you made led you to containerization. Normally, it's stuff like agility, so the ability to quickly spin things up, the ability to get new services up and running. You know, who's working with microservices right now? Let's just get, okay. So like at least 2/3 of us, right? So we know that this is great. We can quickly add things in, we can quickly play around, and equally we can quickly pull things down when they're not working. Perfect. And then we also have that portability factor. So I haven't been in the industry long enough to remember the days of provisioning servers manually and deploying things, but I know there are people that have, and my partner regularly reminds me of the fact that he's been in the job longer and tells me all the war stories. Okay, portability, obviously a big factor, that ability to move stuff around, the ability to change your platforms, you know, not worrying about all the dependencies. And then finally, efficiency. Okay, there's lots of reasons that it's more cost effective to run containers. You all know them, I won't bore you with them. All of these are the reasons you might adopt containerization. However, there's lots of challenges that obviously then immediately come with it. Technology, so using legacy OS, the platform, the applications, there's lots of technology dependencies that come into this initial conversation. I work with UK airports, and I'll talk more about what I do in a moment, but as you can imagine, huge amounts of on-premise technology, huge amounts of legacy software. The idea of simply just containerizing things and putting them on a beautiful platform is just not really that viable without a lot of refactoring. So there's a lot of considerations to get from where they are today to where they would like to be in a more modern place with their technology stack. You also then have staff. I don't know what people's sort of background is, but anyone here working in public sector or kind of aligned to a public sector type organisation? So then you folk know the challenges of recruitment. I mean, everyone has a challenge with recruitment, even those in the commercial sector, but particularly those in the public sector. And so actually having staff, not just with the right skill sets, but more importantly, you're all busy. I'd like to imagine everyone here is busy. And so when someone comes in and says, hey, we've got this great new idea, we're going to go serverless, we're going to go onto containers, and you're going to build it, and you say, well, when? Do you want me to drop BAU? Do you want me to do it alongside it? Like, how's this going to plan out? So that conversation around the skills that you have and actually where you're going to prioritize that is always a challenge. And then finally, it's not as simple as just deploying things into containers. You need to change your entire pipeline. I'm a really big fan of GitOps. I've done some talks on that. Happy to talk about GitOps afterwards, but that approach would require changing kind of entire CI/CD pipelines, getting the buy-in. You know, just because you decide as the platform team that you're going to a developer platform that maybe is container-based, doesn't mean you can force the developers to use it. And if you do, you might have a battle. So one of the conversations I've had with some customers is actually, great, you want to build a great new platform, you want to enable your staff, but they're going to have to change the way they work, and they're going to have to change some of their processes. And do you, again, have the time and the commitment to walk through that process? And have you considered the impact of that further down the line? So in this talk, we're going to deep dive some of the thought processes that factor in some of this as we go through. As I mentioned, my name is Shaffi. I'm a solutions architect. I'm a generalist, so I try and know a little bit about everything, but I also try and specialise in containers alongside that, mostly for my own sanity, so that I don't feel like a jack of all trades, master of none all of the time. Some of you will definitely know more about stuff. Feel free to come and pick my brain afterwards. I may do the same in return, but really hoping that we can share some of the learnings along the way. So where does it all begin? Container orchestration. Okay, most of you will be familiar with it, but for those who are still on that learning journey, just bear with me a minute while I just level set for those in the room. Container orchestrator tools try to deal with these questions, okay? There's a few up there, how do you communicate? How do you enable service communication inside your containers, outside of your clusters? How do you manage secrets? How do I pass the database password through into that container so it can create that connection? How do we, optimize our nodes? Okay, containers are deployed onto our nodes. If you're in the AWS world, it's probably EC2 or a serverless option. And then if it's EC2, or if you're running things on premise or even in another cloud, how are you going to make sure that you actually are really using all the instances that you've provisioned? And then, of course, things like container lifecycle and rollouts. There's loads and loads of questions that come into the management, and that's what container orchestrator tools try to achieve. High level, it's split into two core concepts. Control plane, that's your brain of the operation. That's the thing that kind of makes the decisions, sends the instructions, is that main sort of point in the middle. And then your data plane. So this is your actual applications, your databases, your storage, everything that effectively is your application stack. So for those who aren't as familiar with AWS, effectively you can just think of it like this. So EKS and ECS is that control plane part of it, and the data plane being your EC2 or maybe Fargate. Now some of you will think, well, ECS, control plane. We do have a control plane with ECS. It's just very abstracted away from you. EKS, manage Kubernetes service, ultimately manage control plane. Managing, and this isn't a Kubernetes talk, but for anyone who has played around with Kubernetes, scalability and managing the control plane is quite a big task. So EKS came along to say, well, let's manage that part for you. It doesn't manage the data plane though. We're going to get into that in a little bit. ECS takes that even further with the abstraction, but there ultimately is a control plane that sits under the hood that's going to make those decisions. So then the question gets to, well, which one do we choose? Do we go ECS? Do we go EKS? At a really high level, they kind of look like the same thing. So often the answer we give is, it depends, which is super helpful in your decision-making process. And if you've ever worked with Amazon a lot, you'll hear it a lot. It depends, my favorite answer. Sometimes I say it when I don't know the answer, and it's a great way to buy a moment while I think. But honestly, in this case, it actually really does depend. But just really high level, they kind of look like the same thing. If I was to draw you out some architecture diagrams high level, you're not going to see massive differences, okay? We're going to use ECR, or Elastic Container Register, holding all of our Docker images. On each of our nodes, so this box in the middle, we are going to have, in the ECS world, the ECS agents running, the Docker runtime is running, and then, of course, the containers. All of the different tasks, all the different containers we need. And on the EKS side, it looks very similar, okay? We have a node, the difference now being that we have kubelet running on there, we have the containerd runtime, and then, of course, we have our containers. We have load balancing, we have networking, there's all these things kind of built in. But where the differences come from is this next part. You choose your orchestrator, that is the first of many decisions. How complex those decisions are depends entirely on which direction you just went. For the ECS mode, as we're going to talk about in a moment, many of these are kind of like out-of-the-box decisions that are simply a yes, no, I'll have that, I won't have that, and it's very simple to kind of set up. And that's one of the benefits, that powerful simplicity. But for the EKS side, one of the great things is you have so many choices that you will get decision fatigue, because you will read 1,000 blogs and each one of them will recommend something completely different, and each one will trash talk something completely different. And so it's for you to sort of work out, well, what fits our needs, and you have to go through a lot of evaluation. Now, there's a really good reason for doing that sometimes. You may work in industries where that level of control is actually mandated and not just optional. You might, however, just have a manager who really, really loves making things complex, and it's your job to find the right answers. Apologies if you're in that box. Unfortunately, it does happen, but there's lots and lots of choices. I'm going to try and bring some of these to life in a little bit, so normally when people come to me and we're on a call, and I will take calls with customers, and I'll speak to them and say, well, if you want things that are fairly simple and you need to get up to stage quickly, ECS is a great shout, right? And if you need that real flexibility and that fine-grained control, EKS is a great shout. But that doesn't really explain why. That just tells you, okay, here's a really high-level framework. So what I'm going to try and do is break that down a little bit. Let's go with a very simple scenario. I feel like we're all learning AWS for the first time ever, okay? We're all preparing for our Solutions Architect exam, and we're going to look at the 3-tier web stack. Anybody remember those days? Anybody do the SA Associate exam? Okay, and you had like 1 million questions on your 3-tier web. Well, welcome to that session. This is what's happening. Very simple example, and I appreciate that obviously things get very complex in the world of containers, but just to keep it easy to demonstrate. Let's think about what this would look like if I was to do an ECS. Let's imagine that you are going to the console, okay? Has anyone not used the ECS console or the AWS Management Console? Anyone at all? Okay, I've got 1 or 2 people. Click through console, you go in, you basically choose a load of options. You of course can do all this with APIs, and there's lots of other ways, Terraform, etc. But we'll all imagine we're on the console. You go in, you start by provisioning a cluster. You have a few choices to make. Do you want to go EC2, or do you want to go FileGate, which is serverless, and then you don't have to worry about managing the node groups? You make some choices on security. You simply say, do you want KMS? Do you want to use encryption and my key or your key? And we've got a few choices to click through. And then we've got some things where, for example, we might say, do we want container insights? So do we want to capture all the logs from inside the container? We make some networking choices. So I say, which VPC am I deploying this into, within which region, and which subnets do I want to make available to the cluster? We then move on very quickly. It's like literally a 5-second click, and we're on actually defining the task. So for each of my layers, I need a task definition. So sorry to those who know a lot about ECS, but for those who are less familiar, the idea is you set up a task definition, just like a YAML file defining the pod for those who are more familiar. And in there, you define the things you would need to define, right? So your memory and your CPU, the container image you're going to use. You put in some port mappings, any storage, and of course things like roles and login, the things, the traditional AWS things that you need in order to execute things from within your container and collect your logs. Once you have your task definition for each one of these layers, you then set up a service, okay? Now, a service has a different meaning in ECS than it has in EKS. A service in EKS is more like a deployment, kind of in the world of Kubernetes. And so a service is where you say, right, with that task definition, so with that kind of outline of what I need, I want this many replicas, so how many minimum, how many maximum running, what kind of deployment do I want as I perform my updates and I roll this out, and then you make some choices on service discovery. And that's it. As long as you had a VPC configured, make some choices around your security groups, your app is up and running. It actually is a very, very simple thing to do. You only need really some AWS skills and a fairly good understanding of kind of containers. I mean, really actually not even to do the deployment part side of it. And you are pretty much up and running. Okay, you might have an architecture that looks something like this, and apologies, I realise it's not as clear on these screens as I hoped. Loads of integrations, right? We've got IAM, Secrets Manager, CloudWatch, EBS. And what's different here is they're native. You don't have to think about them, you don't have to deploy add-ons, you don't have to deploy, sometimes you have to deploy sort of agents, but that's, a service by service. But for the most part, it's completely abstracted. You just set up these choices, you're able to kind of make an API call if you're doing it that way, and those integrations will happen seamlessly under the hood. You don't really have to think about anything. Now in EKS, we all know that this looks very different. The first bit's fairly simple, okay? Setting up the control plane, the EKS control plane is very simple. You're gonna go in, you're gonna choose the version of Kubernetes you want, preferably one that's up to date so that you don't have to get into the update debate. That is a completely different talk, happy to do it on another occasion. We're going to make some networking choices again, because once again, we do need to choose our VPC. We'll talk about login. And then at this point, thankfully, we can now choose to have some add-ons that will be nicely installed for us. Great. There's your AWS knowledge. Now, you need to step out of AWS and see how much you know about Kubernetes, because there are a lot of artifacts that you need to make, a lot of YAML files you're about to start writing. The first one we're going to have is, the deployment, the pod file itself, where we think about that task definition, we need to understand how we're going to write that. We then have to think about services. Now, service in this context, for those that aren't aware, is where we choose how we're going to expose that container to internal or external. So whether we're going to use like a node port to expose kind of ports on the node or cluster IPs, etc. We then also need to set up some mapping between IAM and our identity providers, whatever OIDC we might be using. We then have to install some ALB controllers. We need to think about how we're going to be doing ingress. There's a lot around storage. We need to understand persistent volumes and PVCs, so persistent volume claims. There's a lot of decisions around node placement and whether we're going to use labels and selectors or taints and tolerations, and all these words for those who don't know Kubernetes is the point I'm trying to make. There's a lot here that you have to learn before you can even get to the point of actually deploying something. And that's not to scare people off. I really love Kubernetes and I really enjoy working with it, but it's just understanding that there is quite a steep learning curve. Now you can, of course, enlist some friends. You don't have to do all this manually. There are lots and lots of add-ons. I think I've lost count of how many CNCF add-ons there are, but there are lots and lots of community and open source projects that are designed to remove a lot of the heavy lifting. Helm charts, for example, one of my favorites, is a way to be able to kind of simplify all the deployments with all the add-ons and things that you need in a unified way. You have policy engines like Calico who make setting up policies and maintaining them really simple. Carpenter, for those, anyone using Carpenter today? Got a few people. Brilliant, brilliant project, which enables that serverless offering within Kubernetes, one of my favorite projects. So there's a lot of support there, but it does require a lot of knowledge. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to walk through a couple of challenges that you might be facing and some of the sort of thinking that we're going to go through. I'm also going to check the time because I really wasn't joking about my time management. It's absolutely shocking. So, challenge one. Time and resources, okay? You are being tasked with getting something up and running quickly. You don't have lots of time. You don't have months and months and months to plan this. And you also have limited resources. You might be thinking, I'm going to say straight away, go for ECS. Well, no, this is the point. This is where we stop and we say, okay, where are we at today as a business? What skills do you have already? If you have Kubernetes skills, and actually it wouldn't take a long time to build something, great. If you don't, it's a long, steep learning journey to acquire those skills. And ECS, again, requires AWS skills and at least AWS knowledge. Do you have that? Where are you starting from? What position are we in? And actually, to the point I made earlier, what time and resources do your staff have and do you as a business have? Could you acquire Kubernetes skills if you had a big enough budget to go and pay for somebody? Do you have staff that have the capacity to upskill? Do you have enough time? Now, if the answer to those are, yes, we have time, or yes, we have skills, or maybe, we don't have the skills, but we could hire somebody, then absolutely EKS could be a very viable option. If you need all the features of EKS, and this is a really core point I want to kind of reiterate, if you are starting from a point where you don't have those skills, and even AWS skills are shorter lived, then absolutely ECS is what we would normally recommend. And I say recommend because neither is the wrong decision. One of them might make you cry at night because you realise you've done the wrong thing, and one of them is going to leave you feeling more relaxed. But they're not wrong technically, it's just that they obviously come with different cost trade-offs. And so, as I say, ideally, probably ECS is going to fit this. Even really complex workloads can run really well in ECS. I work with customers that are running thousands and thousands and thousands of instances, really complex microservice architectures. I think there's a little bit of a myth sometimes that it can't kind of handle the scale. It's not that it can't, but you don't have as much control, admittedly, and there are kind of elements where you're going to have to kind of decide how much kind of networking and sort of fine-grained control you need. And again, EKS, just be really honest about what you're going to need as an organisation to get to that point. Okay, another challenge, and this is something that we see a lot. Actually, many customers were already running vanilla Kubernetes, as we'd call it, and that might be on-prem, it could be in another cloud. Now, let's imagine for a moment that you've been asked to move that application stack from an existing Kubernetes into EKS or into AWS. We won't say EKS just yet. So again, we do have to have that conversation about skill set, because if you have Kubernetes skills, of course, jumping into EKS from whether it's AKS, whether it's on cloud or on-prem is not going to be a big challenge. But one of the things I would challenge is that is a perfect time to just stop and think. Kubernetes has a huge overhead that you may be struggling to handle and you may be struggling to manage. And so a straight swap in might seem the logical answer at the beginning, but I would challenge you to really stop and think, do we actually need Kubernetes? Do we need that EKS cluster? Or do we need it for this particular project? If we know that setting up ECS is going to be simple, and we know that actually that's not going to be a long process, we need to think about the ongoing management overhead. Are you taking your problems that you already have just now into another cloud with the same level of management overhead that you had before? And this is where the answer might be, well, actually, our developers, our teams all love it, our SRE teams love it, the DevOps love it. Stop telling us what to do, Grace. Actually, it works perfectly, and we're happy to make that over, and we have the resources, and we have the commitment, and actually, we think this is the right choice. And that's absolutely fine, but actually taking the time to assess. I have worked with customers that are running very simple workloads in Kubernetes environment, and the return on investment for that business in the total cost of ownership of actually managing and maintaining it from an engineering perspective doesn't balance out. Now, that being said, I work with some customers who are very happy to still do it because it keeps their teams happy. Their teams continue to learn. They feel like they're getting the skills that are kind of industry in demand, and they've made that decision to have that trade-off. But that is a decision and a conversation for businesses to have. And again, that final one is then just around the people. So as I say, like, what skills do you have? What are people going to need? So final challenge then we'll talk about is granular control. So as I mentioned, we could go a million ways with this. I chose networking because for some strange reason, it's like my second favorite topic. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to anyone, including myself. But we're going to go down the net. Any other networking fans? Do we have anyone that's... Oh, okay, we've got a few. It's logic, isn't it? It's just black and white. It is what it is. Yeah, okay. I'm glad it's not just me. So, again, welcome back to our 3-tier web app. We've missed you. It's been very emotional. Let's talk about networking. ECS, security groups. We love them. They're simple. We define things. We say, this security group can talk to this IP range. We'll lock it down to my IP only. It's very straightforward, okay? What happens under the hood, for those who aren't aware, is that when you create a task in ECS, it creates an ENI, and that ENI can be mapped to a security group. So we apply security groups kind of in the same way that we would do in any other way. It's a very simple decision to make. EKS offers loads and loads of choices now when it comes to, well, not now, but like loads of choices when it comes to security of networking. So yeah, we can still use security groups, straightforward if we're happy with that. But we can also write custom policies that are based on kind of Kubernetes artifacts or concepts like namespaces and labels. And we can also then make use of policy engines, which can be really handy for keeping this very under control as it scales. So I want to talk for an example. Again, 3-tier web app at the top. ECS rules might look something like this. You know, security group for this one is the front end, will allow any kind of HTTPS traffic from anywhere. Perfect, easy enough. Hopefully, again, anyone who's done any of the SA associate stuff will be sick of seeing this stuff. But yeah, you know, security group now for the logic tier, and we'll say we're only going to allow traffic coming from the front end. That makes sense. We don't want direct connections from the public internet. You know, traditional networking, nothing fancy here. And then the usual, we'll say this is a MySQL server, 3306 from that security group logic. Again, no direct connection from the front, nothing from the internet. Fairly straightforward. Now, we could recreate this in EKS very simply using labels instead. And we could just say, you know, these apps are going to have a label front end. Apps can have, pods can have multiple labels, and that's worth remembering for the next part. So this can be the front end. And again, the rules are exactly the same. Nothing's particularly changed here. Now, why would you go to the effort? It's a simple concept. Well, because we're not normally deploying a 3-tier web app. What we're normally looking at is something that's more microservice-based. And I didn't want to get too complex with this, but just to keep it very high level, let's just imagine our front end is actually made up of a number of different microservices. I ran out of creativity, and so we just have microservice 1, 2, and 3, apologies. And then the data layer maybe, we've got some stuff going on in there. So now I might say, I want to have multiple different policies that are going to potentially use labels to group things and labels on an individual level. And then this way I can actually apply multiple different policies to artifacts as I place them in. And I might, for example, say that for the data layer, I will allow traffic from any of the apps where the label equals front end. And all of those apps can have multiple labels. They might have labels microservice 1, 2, 3. They might also have a secondary label that's related to front end. And that means that we can apply that policy at a wider level. And then we also might, for example, say, yeah, for microservice 1 specifically, this is the only one that's going to be allowed to take traffic from the internet. But the rest obviously will be able to communicate. So just to give that example, that actually as we move to more complex fine-grained controls, there is a lot of granularity that can be offered when we use Kubernetes in comparison. Back to my point though, if you don't need that level of control, if you don't need that complexity, you can use the simple things of EKS, or you could just use ECS as an option. Thankfully, you can bring a friend. We love the networking sort of add-ons within. These are just some of the ones that our customers are using. These policy engines really simplify that management, and they can obviously make sure that the applications are all deployed, reliably and consistently. So next point through our scenarios is we've started this which one, one or the other. Actually, a lot of customers use both. Is anyone using both at the moment? Okay, got a couple of hands, yeah. I am a firm believer of the right technology for the problem, or the right kind of platform for the problem, and not, we'll just do one. There are many customers who will start with ECS as an entry point to start using containers and build up that container practice, and then move to EKS as they build more skills and the complexity of the application grows. There are also customers that have clusters sitting in both, because actually managing ECS for simple things is much simpler and reduces the operational overhead. It doesn't have to be an and or. And so actually the decision-making framework that we just went through, I'd actually challenge you to look at that more on a workload basis, as opposed to like an entire application stack. Now, sometimes it just, for the ease of the business, you might just choose to go down one, but actually there's no harm in looking at both of them as options. Now, this used to be quite a complex thing to do, but things like VPC Lattice have made it a really, really simple thing to now enable that communication across clusters, even when we're talking about applications that maybe need to be communicating as part of the same kind of service. Anyone using VPC Lattice at the moment? Have we got any? Oh, surprisingly, very few people. So I love VPC Lattice. I think it actually came out about 6 months after I joined AWS. So we're talking kind of 2 years-ish ago, I think. It really started to gain traction. Definitely one to go and have a look at. Some of the features are that cross-connectivity, not just across clusters, but actually across your accounts, across your VPCs, integrates with EC2, ECS, Lambda, and EKS. And what it effectively can do is create almost that kind of service mesh that we've seen before, but across multiple resources. And then it enables that ability to actually have that observability and traffic control across all of these different places. I won't go too much into sort of the details of how it works, but it's definitely one to look at. But as we can see as an example here, we've got maybe EKS in one VPC, sitting over here we've got kind of EC2, maybe we've got some Lambda, and it's going to enable that service-aware networking across them. So actually it's easier now than ever, and I definitely would suggest having a look if it's not something that you're using today. So I don't know where that last half hour went very quickly, but just to recap on the points of what we talked about. When we're talking about ECS, great choice when you already have the existing AWS skills. When you want to get up and running quickly and you don't have the cost or the overhead to completely, start building the skills from scratch. When you want minimal operational overheads ongoing, because actually getting started is part of it, but the ongoing maintenance and the ongoing operational overheads. I gave this talk at DTX, and I had a gentleman come up to me and he said that he's part of a startup. They need to get a fairly simple kind of web app up and running. And he originally had suggested EKS because he'd read loads of blogs and Kubernetes was the big thing. And he literally said, what are we doing? Like, why have no, we're going to go back. Thankfully, we hadn't actually really built anything. He realized actually what was important to the business was getting this service launched and really catching those customers before their competitors got there. And they just needed to get it up and running, and ECS just made more sense in this example. Legacy applications often sometimes kind of can be simpler when we're looking at ECS deployments. It does suit well to microservices, absolutely does. It can handle complex stuff. And when you need integrations with AWS tooling around CI/CD, they integrate beautifully. It's very easy to use code deploy, code pipeline, etc. Kubernetes, if you have those existing skills or you have a really big budget and you can afford to buy them, even if you have the budget, let's be honest, very difficult to find really highly trained Kubernetes people. And that's implementation level skills, not just kind of people like me who've done the exam and sort of talk about some stuff at fairly high level architecture, but the people who actually can get hands-on on a keyboard, we know they're hard to get hands-on. And if you have those skills, then you'll know that you're very in demand. That need for deep customization and control, whether that's regulatory or just because of the design of the application or the services. When you need that control over deployment, security, or you have very complex networking needs, and Kubernetes often can meet those. And I say Kubernetes, I mean the add-ons as opposed to Kubernetes specifically. And then also, if you really want to rely on the open source community for third-party tools and integrations, then it can be a really good choice to go down. And I'm going to say with a sort of pinch of salt, the complex microservice architectures, it isn't that ECS can't handle them. I think that when it comes to sometimes network and security, you can run into challenges that sometimes can be difficult to debug or to kind of really get full control over. But complex is a very loose word and can mean many things. And what people think is complex often necessarily isn't. It just might mean like a bit of kind of mapping of the service a little bit better. So say, in summary, looking at that technology, understanding the architecture, the networking, the monitoring, and kind of that deployment model that you want to be going for, looking at your staff, and then also looking at your operations and thinking through who else does this impact, what other things are we going to need to change to enable this. The final thing I want to do is just draw some attention to some learning sort of resources. Most people will be familiar with these, Skills Builder, but the one at the end, EKS badge. Who has taken the EKS skills badge? Anybody? My heart is broken. So there is, so last year, several of us came together and we created a course. And it's an EKS course that is designed to really focus on how to actually use it in day-to-day and not just here's a load of knowledge and service features and, here's the FAQ page kind of spilled off. A lot of thought went into this process. I'm an ex-teacher, so obviously I really was passionate about maybe creating something that was actually useful because my own Kubernetes learning journey was challenging. Some of the resources really useful for passing the exam, but didn't really sort of tell me how to actually do things day-to-day. So we created the course. It's about 10 hours of sort of video content with a massive quiz at the end. You actually get a skills badge that's given through Credly, so it's actually kind of validated properly. But if people do want to get a bit more hands, you can skip past sections. If you know Kubernetes really well, feel free to ignore my bit at the beginning, just completely skip over that section, get straight into the hands-on. But it goes through monitoring, observability, networking, etc. We launched it at reInvent, but yeah, if you go into the skills badge and look for that one, then I'd highly recommend doing it, not just because I was part of it, but because a lot of thought went into it from people who work with customers day to day, thought about the conversations they were having, thought about how they actually need to kind of educate people, and they really put that time and effort into it. But that, for me, is done. So thank you. Okay. Do have a few minutes for Q&A if anyone has any questions. I'm normally the person that runs around with a microphone, so might just, oh, there we go. We've got some.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I'm just intrigued around, so when I'm talking, so I work for a software consultancy, and one of the big things that we hear about Kubernetes is people are concerned about cloud vendor lock-in, and maybe I shouldn't ask this at an AWS event.
You can ask.
I was wondering if you'd seen in practice, maybe someone moving from another cloud provider into EKS, that it's made that journey easier, or are people sort of just kidding themselves if they're moving cloud provider? The fact they're on Kubernetes is not really going to help much.
So it would absolutely be easier to avoid vendor lock-in to go from Kubernetes, either EKS on-prem, straight into EKS and avoid that. And it's a simple thing to do. And you would obviously avoid vendor lock-in, absolutely. I mean, obviously you've got the control plane, but we all know that's not really the dominant part of your Kubernetes infrastructure. That's kind of just the small bit that you configure at the start, I guess. I think the thing around vendor lock-in is always an interesting conversation because obviously all clouds will have this conversation with customers. There are benefits to using cloud native tooling and integrating. So if we think about ECS, for example, yes, you are going to be locking yourself in theory, to the ECS service. But actually, for customers that have got mature cloud footprints, have already kind of chose their cloud provider, understand where they're at, the integrations and the ease of service and the reduced overhead trades off for the fact that actually it's a very well-tested service. I think it's easier for us in the container space with vendor lock-in because ECS is obviously the one that people go to. Well, we know that ECS underpins most of our AWS services that are delivered. So a lot of the other services you consume use ECS under the hood. So I think that the vendor lock-in conversation becomes important when you're assessing the cloud maturity and the maturity of that service and the benefits and the trade-offs. So yeah, easy move to Kubernetes, that wouldn't be a problem. But the points I made earlier about what operational overhead are you bringing and continue to bring in, are they worth it, and are you comfortable making that commitment to avoid the potential of being kind of locked into a service that you know has been tried and tested and is high and has kind of that validation? I think that's kind of the conversation we'd have. But no, it's a really good point. And the question I was sort of thinking someone's going to ask, so that's always good. Any other questions? No, stunned into silence. Well, thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.